I've come to the conclusion, and most Americans probably can't even tolerate that I will say this, but that the Chinese system has worked for China. Chinese system has been so beneficial to hundreds of millions of people.
Neil Bush is George W. Bush's brother. And I wouldn't really be as well as Jeb Bush's brother. They must not love him much because they don't mention him much. You know, there's not a lot of talk. Why didn't he give Neil Bush a place in his administration? Probably because Neil Bush actually seems to make some sense. I wouldn't be playing this if it weren't for the fact that Neil Bush is saying essentially the opposite of the entirety of U.S. propaganda. So let's see some of this interview with Jing Li.
China right now is perceived as a threat to the United States by both political parties. And China is an easy whipping boy for political propaganda. You know, it's easy to bash China as infringing on our rights and taking our jobs and whatever, doing all these evil things with TikTok and Huawei and blah, blah, blah. I think the rhetoric will die down as one, after this election is over, first. Second, after we realize that our economy has been damaged by tariffs, China's rise from a very poor bicycling country to a country now that is the leading deployer of electric vehicles on the streets, or, you know, where there's so much prosperity that was unimaginable 50 years ago when I first came here. I've come to the conclusion, and most Americans probably can't even tolerate that I will say this, but that the Chinese system has worked for China. Chinese system has been so beneficial to hundreds of millions of people whose prospects for prosperity were zero back 50 years ago.
Polar opposite of what you get from U.S. propaganda. Polar opposite. The Chinese system is working for China. It has taken hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty. And I keep repeating this statistic because it's unbelievable. It's like, I swear I've had to look at it 12 times just to be certain. Do I really have that right? And this is not coming from China. This is verified by the UN and others. China, over the past 30, 40 years, has taken 850 million people to 3 times the size of the United States of human beings out of extreme poverty. It is utterly unbelievable. And instead of getting any credit for that, they get bashed and torn apart and attacked by the United States. And anyway, here is a member of the, you know, he's obviously one of the offshoot members. He's not the top level oligarchy, but he is one of the members of these oligarch families saying the opposite of U.S. propaganda. And I will talk a little bit about how he does seem a bit naive on some of this. However, I think this is important because this shows that there are some people in these circles that actually have some sense in their head. And by the way, he has been to China 150 times since the 1980s. Okay, let me play another clip here. And I'll speak about some of the things he says that I think sound a bit naive in a few minutes, but.
And so with the opening, with the U.S.-China bilateral trade and with the global trade, with globalization, China has risen. And so I come back for business. I come back to promote my father's longstanding legacy interests in having respectful dialogue, in having better understanding, in finding ways to collaborate on major issues.
I'll just remind everyone that George H.W. Bush, his father is, you know, a warmongering maniac soaked in blood. He's also former head of the CIA. So let's not pretend that George H.W. Bush was a lovely guy. No, both George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, both blood-soaked warmongers. But what Neil Bush is saying makes a lot of sense and is very complimentary of China and says the system works for them. The thing he says that I think is a little naive, which I'll play more of in a minute, but is that he seems to think this is going to fade. And he seems to think that the hatred of China by the United States is, temporary. And after this election, it's going to get better. When in fact, the U.S. is losing its hegemony. The U.S. is a waning empire. There's nothing the U.S. can really do other than try and collapse countries that are competitive to it to stop the fact that it is a waning empire. It is way overextended. It is pumping out trillions of dollars for bombs and death and destruction. And it, to use the terminology I mentioned yesterday by Nafeez Ahmed, it is an old operating system. This is an antiquated operating system the U.S. is in. This capitalist system of money over all else, profit over life, and sustainability. And China, at least, yes, China has a lot of aspects of capitalism, but China, at least, has many aspects that are not actually profit-driven. There are many aspects of the Chinese system that are driven by how will this benefit the people in 10, 20 years. And that's why you're seeing China actually make changes that will benefit their people, such as the changes they made 30 years ago to bring 850 million people out of extreme poverty. Those were not profit-based. That was not greedy capitalists saying, how can we get the most money from things? It was actually a government that said, how can we help these people? So there are plenty of criticisms to be made of China, of just about any system we currently have on this planet. But these are important notes. And he is saying the opposite of what you would get from any other person in the mainstream media, in the mainstream rooms of power, the ivory towers of power.
50 times or something. And afterwards he said, you need to get more people to be like you, just like you did. You need more people to come. And it's true. If you come and visit a country and you have preconceived notions of what it's going to be like, and those notions are challenged by the reality that the people are friendly, the food is great, the progress is tangible. You can see all this progress being made, and there's real evidence if you actually take time to come and look at. Today I came from Beijing on a high-speed rail. Just cruise along, at a very high rate in a comfortable train car. We don't have those in America, and I don't know if they're economically viable or successful in China, but it's something that I'm kind of jealous of. I wish I could get on a high-speed rail to go from Houston to Austin. In my state, it would make so much sense, but we haven't been able to work around regulations or the restrictions to get it done. China gets things done.
And even more so than it being about regulation, the reason you don't have high-speed rail is because in the immediate term, like in the next, 5, maybe even 10 years, high-speed rail is very expensive and not a lot of profit. Even if you charge, because high-speed rail is only useful if you aren't charging $1,000 a ticket. So if you're charging people a reasonable amount of money, then high-speed rail costs, billions of dollars to put in. But you'd have to do it not to gain profit, at least not short term, which nothing in the U.S. system is about not gaining short term profit. Essentially nothing. So, yeah, you could have a high speed rail in New York City, and you could turn cities like Baltimore, where I live, like Washington, D.C., like Philadelphia, into New York City suburbs. I'm not saying all this would be positive, by the way, but I'm just saying you could jump on a train and be in New York City from Baltimore or Washington, D.C. Right now, it takes like 3-4 hours. You'd be in Baltimore or Washington, D.C. in, 30 minutes, 20 minutes. It'd be shorter than a subway ride. I mean, I used to, because I lived in New York City, I used to live in Brooklyn, and my subway trip into the city, into Manhattan, to perform at the comedy clubs, I would often spend a half hour, 45 minutes, on subways, switching subways, those kind of things. So that's going from Brooklyn to Manhattan. Basically, just to skip across the water, it would take me half an hour, 45 minutes. If you had a high-speed rail, that could be Baltimore to New York. And it's just like such a no-brainer from us growing as a species, as a society and everything. But because everything is about freaking profit, no one's doing it. No one's doing it. It's the rich. It has to be done by the rich, right? The rich own the system right now, And so the rich have no interest in doing it because it doesn't get immediate money for them. It's just an unbelievably inefficient, pathetic, antiquated operating system that we live in. That's what capitalism is. And also he mentioned that if you actually come and meet people, guess what? They're not all the stereotypes you've been told to hate. Oh my God, how could that be? You mean if you sat down with your average Chinese family, and let's assume no language barrier for the moment. You sat down with your average Chinese family and had a discussion and chatted. You mean you wouldn't despise them? You mean you'd realize you probably had more in common about your life and your love and your goals and your heart and your soul? You have more in common than you'd have if you sat down across from goddamn Bill Gates or the Koch brothers, the one remaining living Koch brother, or Soros or someone. Yeah, you would. You'd have more in common with that Chinese family. So why are we on Cold War with them? Because it serves the ruling elite. That's why we're in a Cold War with them. Okay, let's do one more clip of Neil Bush, the Bush brother you didn't know existed. And this is probably why you didn't know he existed, because if he's saying things like this, he's probably not allowed at Thanksgiving.
America and all those kinds of things, and eventually things will swing back to a more positive direction. But yeah, you're right. Right now, America. Have you ever heard of the book Destined for War? It's a book by a professor from Harvard who did a study of 16 cases where an established power like the United States, the strongest power, faces a rising power. In today's world, China is a rising power, and in 12 of the 16 cases, it ended up in war. This is over the past 600 years. It ended up in war. And the reason that a rising power, established power, ended up in war is because the established power feels threatened by the rise. And and they make up these claims that the rising power wants to take over and be the most powerful force on the earth, or the rising power is going to take over my economy, or the rising power, you know what I mean? They come up with false narratives. There are many false narratives being planted right now. And I think it's directly related to China's rise and the perceived threat of that rise to our standard of living and to our way of life and to our national security. You know, I don't believe that the rise represents a threat to America. So I'm in a different camp than 90% of the American people. Right?
Because they've been told to believe the propaganda. But so he's right about it's a threat. The rise of China is a threat to American hegemony, to owning the planet, which is what the U.S. elite want to do. He's right about it being a threat. What he's wrong about is he seems to think that these sociopathic ruling elite will back off, that you're just going to see an easing of propaganda, an easing of hatred. Why does he think that? Has he met his brother? Has he met Dick Cheney? Has he met his father? And, you know, I don't, maybe his father would have eased off on China specifically, even though his father was a lunatic as well. But, yeah, no, has he met his brother Jeb? Has he met any of these absolute assholes? They are not going to ease off. I mean, I would love for them to. And I'm going to continue my efforts to do the opposite of U.S. propaganda on China and show people that you can have criticism of China. I think that's fine. Go ahead. But what we're not getting in U.S. media, mainstream media, Western media, from our politicians, from anyone, is what about all the things that are going great in China that we should be talking about and learning from, which is what you should really do. You should look at all these places in the world as experiments in society, and you should pick the things that are working and use them. The U.S. does the opposite. We pick the things that aren't working, and we're like, I like a little of that and a little of that. Oh, you have a bullet chain that gets you, 700 miles in 8 minutes. I do not want any of that. No, thank you, sir. No, take that off my plate right now. Oh, you have a, let's see, over here in that country, you have a police state that puts millions of people in prison. That sounds great. Absolutely. We'll take a little of that. What do we have over here? Oh, you have a policing system where the police are far less intrusive. And in fact, your police murder, they de-escalate things instead of murder people. And they murder on average, 1 to 2 people a year, as opposed to hundreds and thousands of people a year. No. I don't want any of that. That's disgusting. That's disgusting. I tasted it earlier. I don't like it. Get it off my plate. That's how the U.S. looks at the world.